Continuing on, if we look at the definition of politics as who gets what, when, and how, and we say who are the voters and the candidates and you and me and political parties, then what we're talking about when we say who gets what is um, kind of like who gets the benefits of government, right? Not, do you have to be 65 to get Medicare? Do you have to be 63 to get Medicare? Can you be a nationalized citizen? Is Medicare available to non-citizens? Um, and then, in addition to all the benefits of government, we're also talking about who gets the burdens. So, if taxes need to be raised or taxes created or penalties need to be put in place to discourage certain behaviors like cigarette taxes or things like that. We're also talking about that's policy too, and that's politics, right? Like that's going to be wheeled and dealed and discussed and debated and kind of decided on. And so, who gets what? Right? The when is pretty obvious, and the how is how do you get that stuff, right? Like, what is the process by which you can advocate for yourself to secure more benefits or advocate for other people to incur greater taxes or for you to get less taxes? And so the how is basically how we participate in politics and how we participate in government. And it can be something as simple as voting or calling our elected officials or making a donation or straight up lobbying and writing a letter where you're trying to argue and advocate for certain policy. And so who gets what, when, and how is essentially politics. And so at the end of the day, I think what makes politics so enjoyable and kind of gross at the same time is that politics on its very nature has winners and losers, right? It is not a kumbaya game where we hold hands and everyone gets something, right? If I'm getting something extra, that means somebody else is getting less, right? If I am able to get the ear of my elected official and they support my policy, right? That means that somebody somewhere is probably not getting what they want. And so politics does have winners and losers, which is why it's important to get involved in politics. And this is the real call to arms that you're going to get from me all year long, which is I think a lot of people get very discouraged about politics and think that their vote doesn't matter or what's the point? Both parties are crooked and gross and yada yada yada. But at the end of the day, that level of cynicism, it only really serves to hurt you because what we see time and time and time again is that politicians are very generally self-interested people. They're going to go where their votes are, right? They want to maintain their job, they want to maintain their power, right? They want to maintain their ability to affect and impact things, and so they go where the votes are. And that means that they go where people are participating. And at the end of the day, if you choose not to participate, you get very little. And the resources goes to other people. And there's a reason, and let's go third question. Um, no, let's not make this third question because I'm going to give you the answer, which is which demographic or which age group in America do you think votes at the very highest rates? If you said old people, you would be right, right? Basically, the older than 60 years old crowd votes at almost double or even triple the rates of 18 to 30-year-olds. And so there are certain sacred cows in politics that politicians simply will not touch because they know that if they do, they are going to be angering and activating and just basically pissing off people who will show up to vote. And so old people basically get a ton of resources, whether that's, their Social Security and Medicare and all that don't get cut, whether it's funding for senior centers, whether it's memorials for World War II or Vietnam vets, or whether it's greater funding for Americans with Disabilities Acts to make sidewalks. Like old people get things because they vote. And politicians know that they are beholden to them. And so what I always tell your age group, right, which is I don't care whether you show up to vote and write in Ronald McDonald as a write-in candidate for president. The simple fact of the matter is that after the election, when political parties are polling the exit polling results and looking at the demographics of who voted, if the 18 to 25-year-old demographic even showed up at rates of 50%, which would be just an enormous increase. If 18 to 25-year-olds showed up at 50%, guess what would happen? Overnight, I don't care who they voted for, the simple fact that they showed up to vote, politicians are going to be like, "Oh crap. They're starting to get involved. We better serve them because they will punish us if we do not." My biggest thing is I think you would have free college tuition real quick if you guys showed up to vote. But cynicism and the idea that my vote doesn't matter and what's the point, everyone, that it has a cost, right? It has a cost. And the cost is you get very little. Very little attention, very little resources, very little job training, very little higher education funding that gets cut every year. It's why public education, like CU Boulder, 15 years ago was $6,000 a year, and today it's 28,000. It's because they keep cutting the funding for it, because what do they care? You guys don't even vote, right? And so the who gets what, when, and how, if we accept that politics has winners and losers, and political participation and the rates at which you participate is going to determine in many ways winners and losers, then my charge to you as a government teacher is participate, right? You owe it to yourselves. I don't care who you vote for. I don't care how cynical you are. You show up and you vote every single election. And if you do that, you will get the attention and you will get the service and you will get the love of politicians who suddenly feel like they are just as beholden to you as they are to your grandparents. And so the political participation is how you get involved in politics. And the really kind of sad reality here is that America, for all of its Enlightenment principles and Constitution, which hasn't changed in 225 years, and for all it stands for that is good, it's really quite kind of sad and depressing that the political participation rates of America are some of the lowest in the developed world. Like, really, when I say some of the lowest, I mean like tied for lowest. And there's a lot of reasons behind that. Most countries, election day is a federal holiday, or on a weekend. Most countries will have mail-in voting or things like that. Our election day is oftentimes on a Tuesday, and polls close at 7, and we don't make it very easy for people. Colorado does because we have mail-in voting, but many states do not. And so political participation is definitely a part of politics because it determines who wins and who loses. And the sad reality is we're not very good at it, right? And that this low voter turnout impacts who gets the political power, who gets the benefit of policy decisions. It's what I just went over with old people as probably the most glaring example, but also the wealthy, right? Better educated, wealthier people vote at higher rates than poorly educated and poorer people. And so is it any accident that people in the Broadmoor can get their street lights fixed in a hot second, but people in southeast Colorado Springs can't get potholes filled on the streets the size that are like literally swallowing Volkswagen bugs, right? Like, no, right? Like, that sort of policy decision and winner or loser is going to be partially impacted because of political participation rates. Politicians know that if they don't serve those residents at the Broadmoor who all vote and will make the calls and will donate and do all that stuff, then they will lose their jobs. And so, in addition to regular folks participating in politics, we also want to talk about how politics is impacted by something we're going to call single issue groups. And we're going to talk about them later in our course when we get to our linkage institution chapter and we start talking about interest groups like the NRA or the Sierra Club or the AARP, which is the American Association of Retired Persons, or the NAACP, or any of these other issue groups who advocate for certain groups of people, ranging. So what I just said was gun owners, old people / retirees. NAACP is the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, so African American interest groups. These single issue groups also dramatically influence politics as well, because they not only spend a fair amount of money and make donations, but they also actionize their voters, right? If you are part of a single issue group, there's chances are you care a lot about an issue, and that group can simply call you up or send you something in the mail. From if you're an environmentally minded person, the Sierra Club, sends you something in the mail and says, "Hey, we really support." John Hickenlooper for the United States Senate. He's a much greater friend to the mountains and preservation of land. And Cory Gardner is, all in favor of tearing up public lands for drilling and yada, yada, yada. Well, if you're an environmental person who belongs to the Sierra Club, you're probably going to hear that and say, okay, that's all I need to know. I'm voting for Hickenlooper. And so these single issue groups can also have a huge influence on politics. And so right now I'm going to pause and give my next question, which is two questions. Number three, um, have you ever participated in politics? Those of you who are older may have voted or requested a ballot, even if you haven't yet voted. Maybe you have one coming to you for the November ballot, and that will be that. Maybe you've called up a politician to give your thoughts. Maybe you've written a letter. Have you ever participated in politics? If so, how? And then the second one is, if there was a single issue group right now that you would be a part of, what would that be? And if you don't know their actual names, go ahead and just Google real quick, interest group for immigrants' rights, or interest group for environmentalism, or interest group for gun rights, or interest group for whatever. I'm curious as to what single issue group you would be most likely to get involved with. Go ahead and pause, answer those questions, and then we'll go on to the next slide. Okay, so the next slide here is just a couple pictures. And so I told you that the United States has some of the lowest participation rates in the world. And I also told you that younger Americans, particularly in that 18 to 24 demographic, vote at abysmally low rates. So low, in fact, that they get practically nothing from the attention of politicians because they're not flexing their political weight enough to be a winner, right? And so this chart really shows it. From 1972 to 2010, the difference between those 65 years old and older and 18 to 24 was dramatic, right? You can see in some elections it's closer. So like the 1972 election, the 18 to 24 demographic voted at about 50%, which is pretty good. And that was only 12 percentage points lower than the 65 plus. But then you look at, 1994, and you see that 18 to 24-year-olds voted at roughly 18%, while 65-year-olds voted at 62%. And so that's massively different. My question for you, question number 5 is, why do you think that this chart has such an up and down factor? You can see that the high points in both the young and the older demographics are the same. They're aligned. What do you think explains that? It is very figure outable. This is kind of like a puzzle. Look at the trends, look at how often it goes up and down, and see if you can't figure it out. And go ahead and write it in your number 5. So now we'll go on to the question of, how do people shape policy, right? And I said this last slide of basically, well, you participate, right? You vote, you write letters, you make donations, you do those things, but it's more than that, right? At the end of the day, there's an entire unit that we're going to get to probably around November of this year, that's going to talk about linkage institutions. And linkage institutions are any institution of government that links people to the government, right? So what are institutions that link people to the government? That could be a political party. You join it, you're now linked to the government. The media links people to the government by choosing what to focus on the news and what to cover and what interviews to get. It's linking people to government. And then the last one is interest groups. If you join an interest group like the Sierra Club, you are linked to government. And so all of these linkage institutions allow people and voters to transmit their preferences to elected officials and create policy, to create laws. They can do that by, voting in elections, which is technically a linkage institution, joining a political party, advocating through the media, right? Posting something on social media, forming an interest group because you have, a common goal and you want to unite people to organize. And as I already said, an interest group is just an organized group of people that have a common interest. Those, the NRA, the NAACP, the AARP, the Sierra Club are just famous ones. And so these linkage institutions allow people to express their preferences and shape the policy agenda